We continue to bring you the very latest from DDW, Digestive Disease Week. I'm Ed Highland, and I'm joined now by Dr. Emma Halmos. Thank you so much for coming by and sharing with us.
My pleasure.
Let's talk a little bit about gut health, if you would. We'll just jump right into it. Give us a little bit of your background, and then we want to talk about, what diet is best for gut health.
Yeah, so I'm a research dietitian. I'm based in Melbourne with Monash University, and we are best known for developing and assessing the FODMAP diet, which is one of the first-line dietary therapies for managing symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. But I have a huge interest in looking at diet to treat GI disease, not just in irritable bowel syndrome, but inflammatory bowel disease, in celiac disease, and many other luminal conditions.
Could you give us some details on the diet? I mean, just kind of encapsulate it for us.
Of the FODMAP diet?
Yes.
Yeah, so the FODMAP diet is something that FODMAPs is very much an umbrella term that encompasses fermentable sugars. The most common one that people know of is lactose, which is the fermentable sugar in milk and milk products. But FODMAP refers to not just lactose, but many other sugars that act the same way in the body. Fructose is another, oligosaccharides, polyols. And in people with irritable bowel syndrome who have what we call a visceral sensitivity, hypersensitivity of the gut, we find that when we reduce not just one but all of these sugars, what it does is in turn reduce gas that's produced in the colon and fluid as well, and this makes people feel better and controls their symptoms. So the low FODMAP diet is quite helpful, and a lot of the IBS guidelines now recommend it for first-line dietary therapy.
And for my edification, is it flexible? I mean, it's one thing that I think most people come into with, how rigid is it? Can I have some flexibility with this?
Well, yes, and actually I'm a bit biased because I said I'm a dietitian, but I truly believe every single person who applies any sort of dietary therapy should be guided by a dietitian who's well versed in the area. And there's really two approaches to the FODMAP diet. The traditional one is where you essentially over-restrict for a time and get people seeing if they respond well, and then you go through a process of reintroducing certain types of food to identify what's problematic and not, and then long-term, ultimately people find they only need to target a couple of foods to make themselves feel well. That's one approach, and the other is a gentle approach where we might select just a few really, really concentrated FODMAP foods and reduce that, and if that's not enough, we might reduce further.
You touched on it quite a bit, but can you give us some of the top tips that you would be sharing to perhaps get people on the right track, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I think tip number one is you need to understand your disease, and that's where I think dietitian and gastroenterologist comes in to actually be diagnosed and have irritable bowel syndrome explained, and then if they're a good candidate to try diet, to select which approach is best for them. If they're already restricting other foods, or perhaps they're children or adolescents, or there's another reason why we wouldn't want to be so heavy-handed with diet, we might go a gentle approach, and of course for people who prefer that. But if people want to dive right in and do a short-term, more aggressive restriction of FODMAPs, then a dietitian can guide them through that as well.
Now your research, you're based out of Australia. Is there some difference in the way the diet is implemented, so to speak, in different regions of the world? Because our foods are different. Yeah,
somewhat. So, for example, here in the States, I know high fructose corn syrup is something that is cheap and accessible everywhere. It's quite expensive in Australia. We have plenty of sugar cane fields there, so we tend to sweeten with sucrose or even glucose, which are not FODMAPs. So that's only one example of differences in our food composition, and so there are definite differences. But I guess the headlines of the FODMAP diet, a good dietitian will be able to sort of manipulate the information and apply it to the patient that's relevant for their environment and what country they're in.
Fabulous advice. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Emma Halmos, and we're going to be talking about many more things here during Digestive Disease Week, right here on DDW TV.